Pen Argyl, Pennsylvania. October 1898. The autumn wind sweeping down through the Lehigh Gap already carried the biting edge of premature frost, stripping the final brown leaves from the oaks and signaling the end of the brief construction season. In the heart of the slate quarrying district, surrounded by the rapidly expanding shanty towns of immigrant laborers, a man named Owain Prydderch was building a structure that defied every established convention of American frontier architecture. He was not erecting a standard timber frame box, nor was he building a traditional single-room log cabin. Instead, he was raising two entirely separate 14 by 18-foot hewn oak rooms, leaving a massive 10 by 18-foot open breezeway directly between them, all resting on a unified, heavy oak platform. Even more bizarre to the local tradesmen, he was constructing two massive, independent 4-by-4-foot solid slate chimneys, positioning them back-to-back in the center of the structure, flanking the open breezeway. The local community, accustomed to quickly assembled single-hearth boarding houses designed to pack in as many warm bodies as possible, viewed the project with a mixture of bewilderment and open derision. Amos Thatcher, a seasoned lumberman who had built dozens of standard cabins across Northampton County, stood by the muddy road with Ezra Miller, a local quarry boss, shaking his heads at the heavy timber frames rising from the dirt. They watched as Prydderch meticulously fitted heavy winter storm doors to the north and south ends of the open breezeway, effectively creating a sealed central tunnel. "The man is completely foolish," Thatcher remarked, spitting a stream of tobacco into the frosted grass. "He's building a wind tunnel right through the center of his own house. When the January gales hit that gap, that breezeway is going to catch the draft like a ship's sail. And those two separate chimneys are going to suck all the heat straight out into the sky. He'll be burning 10 cords of wood a month just to keep his boots from freezing to the floorboards." Prydderch, balancing on a heavy oak joist with a broadaxe in hand, heard the criticism clearly over the ringing of hammers in the distance. He did not pause his work. He did not turn to argue. He simply drove the steel edge into the timber, carving out a precise mortise, and continued building the strange, divided structure that his neighbors found so absurd. What did this Welsh Snowdonian carpenter understand about Twin-Hearth thermal zoning and the physics of heat isolation that the established building inspectors and experienced lumbermen of Northampton County had completely missed? Before we uncover the brilliant thermal mechanics behind this forgotten architectural masterpiece, please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below. If you engage with this channel, I promise you will learn exactly how historical builders manipulated thermal mass, managed BTU output, and engineered their homes to survive the most brutal weather conditions on Earth without relying on modern technology. Let me know in the comments if you have ever lived in a home with multiple separate heating zones. Owain Prydderch was not a standard American frontiersman. He was not a balloon frame carpenter accustomed to slapping pine boards together with factory-made nails. He was not a sod house pioneer of the Western Plains. He was a master of the Eryri Twin-Hearth tradition, born in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of Snowdonia in North Wales. His hands knew heavy slate blocks, iron-forged splitting wedges, adze-hewn oak beams, lime mortar, and deep masonry ash pits. He had trained on the ancient Twin-Hearth, the traditional Welsh longhouse, a structural form that had evolved over centuries to withstand the howling, moisture-laden gales of the Irish Sea. When he brought his wife, Ellen, and their two young children, Rhys and Cyrus, across the Atlantic to the booming slate belt of Pennsylvania, he brought a deep, ancestral understanding of how stone and timber interacted with extreme cold. The Prydderch family's arrival in Pennsylvania had coincided with a brutal introduction to the American climate. Their first winter in a hastily built, standard-issue quarry company cabin had been a masterclass in misery. The cold in the Lehigh Gap was not the damp, heavy chill of Wales. It was a dry, piercing, absolute freezing that altered the physical properties of the world around them. The suffering was not abstract. It was measured in stark, physical failures. One morning in late January, Prydderch had watched a neighbor's heavy slate-splitting mallet, a tool made of dense cured hardwood, crack straight across the head on the very first swing, the wood fibers having become so brittle in the sub-zero air that they shattered like glass. Inside the quarry clerk's uninsulated field office, the iron gall ink literally froze mid-column in the ledger book, locking the accountant's pen to the paper. Most alarmingly, when Prydderch had reached for his heavy wool coat hanging on an iron peg in the company shed, the moisture trapped in the woolen fibers had frozen so solid that the collar cracked audibly as he pulled it down. The fabric stiffened into a rigid board. These were not mere inconveniences. They were indicators of a thermal environment that standard American frontier architecture was completely unequipped to handle. The conventional cabins built across the Pennsylvania slate belt during this era were fundamentally flawed in their thermodynamic design. A standard quarry cabin consisted of one large, unpartitioned room, usually 20 by 30 feet, with a single cast iron stove or stone hearth located either dead in the center or at one far gable end. The builders relied on the sheer volume of heat generated by a massive, roaring fire to push warmth to the corners of the room. The physics of this approach were disastrous. In a single-room cabin, the single heat source creates a massive, uncontrolled convective loop. The hot air rises violently to the ceiling, travels along the rafters to the cold outer walls, cools rapidly, and drops to the floor, creating a constant freezing draft that sweeps across the floorboards back towards the fire. The harder the occupants fired the stove, the faster this convective loop spun. The perimeter of the room remained perpetually freezing, while the area immediately surrounding the stove became unbearably hot. Neighbors like Silas Boone and Jedediah Vance spent their winters trapped in this cycle, burning massive quantities of hardwood, sometimes a full cord every week, just to maintain a survivable temperature in the center of the room, while water buckets froze solid against the outer walls. The heat was spread too thin over too large a volume, and the lack of interior thermal breaks meant that every time the front door opened, the entire volume of heated air was instantly sucked out into the winter sky, replaced by a wall of sub-zero wind. The Northampton County building authorities, however, were focused entirely on fire prevention rather than thermal efficiency. The rapid expansion of the slate industry had led to crowded, chaotic shanty towns, and devastating roof fires were a constant threat. In response, the local government had implemented the 1895 Pennsylvania Quarry Camp Building Code. This code strictly mandated that all residential structures must either utilize a single, central flue or, if multiple flues were used, the structure must feature full, heavy masonry fire cell separation running from the foundation to the roof line to prevent sparks from traveling through the attic space. It was within this rigid bureaucratic and architectural environment that Prydderch began his build. He laid out the foundation for a classic Dogtrot-style footprint, but heavily modified by his Welsh Eryri tradition. The structure sat on a heavy platform of 12 by 12-inch hewn oak beams, elevated 2 feet off the freezing ground to prevent the earth from wicking away heat. He framed 2 distinct rooms, each exactly 14 by 18 feet, creating 2 perfectly mirrored living spaces. Between them, he framed a 10 by 18-foot open breezeway. The genius and the controversy lay in the chimneys. Instead of a single central hearth, Prydderch hauled tons of premium, dense Pen Argyl blue slate and constructed 2 massive 4 by 4 foot solid masonry chimneys, positioned back-to-back right on the edge of the breezeway, one servicing the east room, the other servicing the west room. He then installed heavy, cross-braced, double-thick oak storm doors at both the north and south entrances of the breezeway. In April, during the initial framing phase, Cyrus Whitmore, the chief Northampton County building inspector, rode his circuit out to the Pen Argyl camps. Whitmore was a stern, highly experienced official whose primary job was ensuring the crowded camps did not burn to the ground. He took one look at Prydderch's twin flues, rising under the framework of a single continuous roofline, and immediately pulled his ledger. Whitmore marched onto the oak platform, citing specific technical violations. He informed the code office, and Prydderch directly, that building two separate flues under one continuous roofline without a full, solid masonry firewall separating the entire attic space was a direct violation of the 1895 Quarry Camp Building Code. The open breezeway, Whitmore argued, created a wind tunnel that would accelerate any stray spark into a conflagration. You cannot run two fires in a divided wooden box without a full stone bulkhead, Whitmore stated with confident authority, writing out the formal citation. The draft through that center trot will pull embers straight under your shingles. You are ordered to either tear down one chimney and consolidate, or build a 2-foot-thick slate wall through the center of that breezeway. This is professional negligence. Prydderch wiped the sawdust from his hands, took the citation paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in his pocket. "The fires are separate, and the doors will seal the draft," he said quietly. He picked up his adze and returned to shaping the floor joists. The physics of what Prydderch was building went far beyond mere fire safety. He was constructing a highly advanced system of Twin-Hearth thermal zoning. By dividing the home into two distinct, isolated cells separated by a sealed breezeway, Prydderch was manipulating cubic volume and British thermal units, BTUs, with incredible precision. Each room was exactly 252 square feet. In a standard cabin of 500 square feet, a central stove would need to output approximately 18,000 to 20,000 BTUs per hour just to maintain a baseline temperature against a harsh wind, and even then, the heat distribution would be terrible. Prydderch's design allowed the family to run the home dynamically. The east room served as the parlor and main living quarters, while the west room served as the kitchen and sleeping area. Because the two rooms were structurally isolated by the heavy oak walls and the 10-foot air gap of the breezeway, they could be heated independently. When the heavy winter storm doors on the north and south ends of the breezeway were closed and barred, that 10 by 18-foot space ceased to be a wind tunnel and instantly transformed into a massive thermal buffer, a trapped pocket of dead air that prevented the brutal north winds from ever touching the interior adjoining walls of the living spaces. This meant that Prydderch could run the east parlor hot, maintaining a comfortable 75 degrees Fahrenheit, while allowing the west kitchen to drop to a manageable 62 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. The heat loss per room was drastically reduced to approximately 4,500 BTUs per hour, even when the outside temperature plummeted to negative 18 degrees. The 4-by-4-foot solid slate chimneys acted as massive thermal batteries. Slate is incredibly dense, possessing a high specific heat capacity. As the fires burned, the slate absorbed the thermal energy, storing it deep within the stone matrix. Long after the flames had died down to embers, those massive stone columns continued to radiate soft, even infrared heat into the 252 square foot rooms. Because he was only heating the specific space the family was occupying, and because the total cubic volume of that space was strictly limited, Prydderch's total fuel consumption dropped to just 40% of what a standard single cabin required. He wasn't trying to heat a barn. He was heating a tightly controlled thermal envelope. The ultimate test of this architectural defiance arrived in January of 1899. The Pennsylvania Slate Belt was hit by a polar clear sky weather event, a meteorological phenomenon where a massive high-pressure system strips all cloud cover away, allowing the Earth's radiant heat to escape directly into the atmosphere, causing temperatures to plummet drastically. For 10 consecutive nights, the temperature in Pen Argyl held, sustained at -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Worse, a 20-mile-per-hour north wind howled continually through the geographic funnel of the Lehigh Gap, creating a wind chill that was actively dangerous to human life. The conditions were so extreme that the chemical properties of the fuel itself began to fail. Inside the uninsulated quarry sheds, the kerosene in the lamps thickened, and the flames burned with an eerie, weak blue light, unable to vaporize properly in the freezing air. Across the settlement, families fought a desperate, losing battle against the cold. Silas Boone and his family slept in their heavy coats, dragging their mattresses directly onto the hearthstone, burning through a cord of oak in just 5 days. Yet the water in their wash basin still froze solid by morning. The cold knifed through every gap in their single-room cabins, the massive convective loops pulling the freezing air across their faces as they slept. At the Prydderch Dogtrot cabin, however, the reality was entirely different. The numerical contrast was staggering. Outside, the wind howled at -18 degrees, the frost driving deep into the oak siding. Inside the east parlor, the ambient air temperature held steady at an astonishing 75 degrees. The heavy slate chimney radiated a deep, penetrating warmth that filled every corner of the 252-square-foot space. The image of this contrast was striking. Outside, the brutal 20-mile-per-hour wind battered the heavy oak storm doors of the breezeway, the iron hinges groaning under the pressure of the gale, the wood rimed with white frost. But inside the parlor, completely isolated from the violent weather by the thermal buffer of the breezeway, Owain Prydderch was humming softly as she worked. The air was filled with the rich, savory smell of roasted mutton and wild leeks, and the only sound competing with the crackle of the hearth was the steady, rhythmic clack of her wooden knitting needles. A delicate, precise task that would have been completely impossible if her fingers were numb from cold. The cold had been locked out. The home was a fortress of warmth. On the 4th day of the deep freeze, Cyrus Whitmore was out on the roads. Despite the perilous conditions, the building inspector was driving his circuit, wrapped in heavy furs, checking on the structural integrity of the quarry camps and ensuring that desperate families hadn't started dangerous, uncontained fires in their shanties. The roads were solid sheets of rutted ice. As Whitmore's horse-drawn sled approached the Prydderch property, the extreme brittleness of the frozen metal and wood finally gave way. With a loud, sharp crack, the right runner of Whitmore's sled shattered against a frozen rut right at Prydderch's front gate, pitching the sled sideways and dumping the inspector into the freezing snow. Whitmore, his face drained of color and his hands shaking uncontrollably from the biting wind, knew he could not survive long exposed in the -18-degree gale. He scrambled up the icy path toward the strange divided cabin. He expected to find a freezing, drafty disaster. He expected the open breezeway to be a wind tunnel of misery. He threw his weight against the heavy north storm door of the breezeway, pushed it open, and ducked inside, quickly pulling it shut behind him. Instantly, the roaring of the wind vanished. The breezeway was cold, but the air was entirely dead, still, and calm. Prydderch, hearing the commotion, opened the heavy internal door leading to the east parlor. Whitmore stepped across the threshold, and the sensory contrast struck him like a physical blow. He had expected the biting, drafty chill of a typical frontier cabin, the desperate, localized heat of a single stove fighting a losing battle. Instead, he felt a thick, enveloping wall of absolute dry warmth. He stood in the entryway, his frozen leather boot soles beginning to thaw instantly against the warm oak floorboards, the frost melting from his eyebrows in seconds. The air in the parlor was a perfect 75 degrees. Prydderch didn't say a word about the citation. He simply pulled a heavy wooden chair near the massive slate hearth and gestured for the inspector to sit. Whitmore, still shivering as his core temperature slowly rose, stared at the massive 4x4-foot slate chimney. It wasn't just throwing heat from the firebox. The entire stone column was radiating warmth like a captured sun. The ultimate proof of Prydderch's engineering was sitting right on the slate fire shelf. It was a heavy earthenware crock of traditional Welsh caul, a thick broth of lamb and root vegetables. It was a tradition in the Eryri region to keep a pot of caul simmering continuously through the deep winter. Ellen had placed it on the warm stone shelf, away from the direct flames, relying entirely on the radiant heat of the heavy slate mass to keep it at a perfect, food-safe temperature. It had stayed warm and savory continuously through the freezing weeks and would remain so all the way through Gwyl Dewi, St. David's Day, in March. Down the road, in the standard single-room cabins, every quarry camp neighbor's stovetop pot froze solid hours before the coals even had a chance to completely cool. Whitmore accepted a steaming bowl of the caul, wrapping his shaking hands around the warm clay. He looked around the small, perfectly heated 252-square-foot room, then thought about the massive, freezing single-room cabins he had inspected all morning, where families burned 3 times the wood to achieve a fraction of this comfort. He looked at the heavy slate chimney, independent and safe, radiating heat without threatening the roofline. "You didn't build a cabin," Whitmore said quietly, the authority completely gone from his voice. "You built a thermal valve." Prydderch nodded slowly, taking a sip of his tea. "We heat the room we are in," he replied simply. "The wind can have the rest." Whitmore never filed the citation with the county clerk. Instead, he spent the next hour meticulously sketching the dimensions of the twin flues, the exact placement of the storm doors, and the cubic volume of the separated rooms. He realized that the 1895 code was flawed. It assumed a structure had to be one continuous volume of air. Prydderch had proven that dividing the volume and separating the heat sources was not only safer, but vastly more efficient. The validation of Prydderch's Welsh Twin-Hearth design did not remain a secret. The local community, desperate for relief from the brutal winters, quickly took notice of the family that burned less than half the wood of their neighbors, yet never suffered a frozen water bucket. In March of 1899, the Cymro American Aed, a prominent Welsh-American newspaper published out of Wilkes-Barre, printed a detailed architectural diagram of Prydderch's twin-flue Dogtrot design, celebrating the successful adaptation of the Eryri longhouse tradition to the Pennsylvania climate. The spread of the technique was rapid and measurable. By the autumn of 1899, before the next winter could set in, 6 different Welsh quarry families across Northampton and neighboring Monroe counties had adopted the double hearth design. They retrofitted existing cabins by building heavy internal partition walls and erecting secondary slate chimneys, effectively cutting their living spaces in half and managing their BTUs with precision. The local timber merchants noted a significant drop in cordwood sales to those families, proving the 40% fuel reduction was not a fluke, but a reliable scientific reality of thermal zoning. Today, modern building science relies heavily on the exact principles Owain Prydderch implemented in 1898. We use advanced, multi-zone electronic HVAC systems, programmable thermostats, and motorized duct dampers to ensure we are only heating the specific rooms we occupy, rather than wasting massive amounts of energy heating empty spaces. Passive house standards utilize thermal buffer zones and airlocks to prevent direct wind infiltration, mirroring the exact function of Prydderch's sealed breezeway. He achieved with heavy oak, solid Pen Argyl slate, and ancestral knowledge what modern engineers achieve with microchips and fiberglass. The story of the Twin-Hearth Dogtrot cabin is a testament to the power of targeted efficiency over brute force. Owain Prydderch didn't heat one big cabin against the winter. He didn't try to build a bigger fire to fight a bigger cold. He raised two distinct rooms with two separate fires, and he heated only the one he was in. He understood that survival on the frontier was not about generating the maximum amount of energy, but about managing the space that energy had to fill. If you found this exploration of frontier thermal engineering and historical building techniques fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. What is the most effective method you have used to zone or isolate heat in your own home? Let me know your thoughts. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions and architectural narratives for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, specific names, and dialogue events are fictionalized representations. However, the building techniques, thermal principles, and historical contexts are based on real historical practices and documented architectural history. Modern application of any building, heating, or construction technique should always follow current localized building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.